here. So the next thing on the agenda is the Technical Committee report that will be given by Charlton Goodman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So the Technical Committee met on September 9th to discuss the biological implications of the draft addendum 4, and this is a following summary of our discussion. The proposed F target of F.8.18 and F threshold are expected to maintain the long-term average SSB at or near the corresponding SSB targets and thresholds. However, there is a probability of SSB occasionally declining below the SSB threshold, even while F is maintained at the target. This is due to the natural variability in recruitment because of environmental conditions that are beyond our control. We've talked about this already this morning. Also, a lag time in strong year classes contributing to SSB, just as the 2011 year class, we've looked at it's going to take a few years to get in there and start affecting SSB just because of the maturation schedule. However, SSB is expected to recover without additional management action as long as F is maintained at or below F target. Relative to the timeline to reduce F to the target, reducing F to the target in 1 year will be more beneficial to increasing SSB. It will increase SSB, quicker and protect the 2011 year class than reducing in 3 years. However, higher levels of SSB do not necessarily result in stronger year classes. We talked about this a little bit as well. This is evident when the stock was pretty high. We did have some poor year classes come through. 99, 02 was a poor year class, and then right behind it, 03 was one of the biggest we've had. 06 and 08 are some other examples of poor year classes when stock size was fairly high and able to reduce big year classes. The 2011 year class, of course, is like the top 4 or 5th recruitment in the time series in the stock assessment. So. Relative to the proposed management programs, status quo, if total harvest remains unchanged, there's less than a 1% probability that F will be at or below its target within 1 or 3 years. Relative to reducing the F target within 1 year, although all the recreational management options achieve the required reductions, the TC has greater certainty in the percent reductions of simple management measures, such as changes in the bag limit or changes in the size limit, as compared to more complex management measures, such as slot and trophy fish options. TC also wanted to point out that changes in angler behavior, for example, relative to effort, discards, poaching, may also impact the percent reductions in harvest, and there's no way to really quantitatively account for this. Just for example, since 2003 and Amendment 6, the recreational harvest on the coast has ranged from 19 to 31 million pounds, so there's a lot of environmental conditions, economic factors, and other things that are just hard to predict what's going to happen and quantitatively account for these. The TC is unable to really quantify biological benefits of one option over another because of these uncertainties in the projections as well, such as selectivity patterns, fecundity, stock-specific exploitation, and the maturity schedule. So TC does not have a specific recreational management option, but does remind the board that more simple management measures have been successful when managing striped bass in the past. Relative to the recreational fishery options in the Chesapeake Bay, the TC just wanted to point out that if the board is concerned about conserving the 2011 year class, option B12, the slot limit for the bay recreational fishery, would seem to be the least preferred option. The TC did have some discussion that the use of the recreational quota in the bay has been helpful in maintaining a stable fishery in the bay through time. We did talk about the trophy fishery in the bay. It is accounted for in the harvest reduction analyses. Therefore, options B10, B11, B14, and 15 assume the 28-inch for Maryland and 32 for Virginia Spring trophy fisheries. Likewise, option B12 assumes no trophy fisheries, and option B13 assumes the trophy fisheries operating at 36 inches. Relative to reducing the F target within the 3 years with the 17% harvest reduction, the TC just wanted to make a point that a constant harvest strategy held for several years is better for management evaluations when we redo stock assessment analyses than regulations that are constantly changing. This just kind of goes to the 3-year stepwise 7+7 harvest reduction. It's just difficult to evaluate management when the regulations are changing from year to year to year, associated with all the other uncertainties with angler behavior and harvest. For the commercial fishery options, the TC just noted that none of the proposed commercial quota options achieved enough necessary level of harvest reductions. The TC recommends taking the harvest reductions from the 2013 total commercial harvest and let the board reallocate as they see fit. Relative to the commercial quota transfers, the technical committee is concerned that at a time when we're needing to take reductions, if the percent reductions are taken from Amendment 6 quota instead of the 2013 level of harvest, allowing commercial transfers in conjunction with that could have the potential to increase harvest. The TC also wants to point out that if transfers are used, conservation equivalency would need to be maintained between states if they have different size limits. So a lot of states do have, we don't have the same commercial coastal size limits, and that sort of thing would need to be taken into consideration if the transfers were allowed. For the commercial size limit, the TC does not recommend matching the commercial and recreational size limits. Recommends maintaining the same minimum size limits because the percent reductions are applicable to the current fishery selectivities. Selectivities would have to be changed as well the next time a stock assessment is updated, and that's relative to any of the size limit options. Really, the selectivities will change with assessment updates. And as Mike discussed earlier, the TC is also concerned there's a lot of gear regs that have been in place for the 28-inch or for whatever state's minimum size limit is, and if we increase those size limits, that may result in more discards. The technical committee did recommend option B for that. And just a general comment, we've touched about this just a little bit as well, but the changes in the MRIP methodology and implementation are also going to make it, that's just going to add another level of uncertainty as we assess the changes in the harvest moving forward through future stock assessments and stock assessment updates. And I'll take any questions.
Question from Charlton. Okay, Robert, and then Tom.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much, Charlton. The question I have is, earlier today, I think Dave Borden was asking about, I think what he was asking was, how do you know when you've achieved your target, essentially, and you know, maybe more so, how do you know, from my point of view, what has resulted in achieving the target, since you have more than one thing at play here. You've got an abundance that plays into this. You have a harvest, and in this case, you also have discards. So you mentioned the 777 was deemed by the technical committee to be problematic because of the management changes. However, when the assessment is done, the update is done, it's not really going to focus on the management changes. It's going to focus on SSB and F. And so I'm not really sure why that comment was made by the technical committee in light of the new methodology that has been used using the statistical catch-at-age model, and maybe you could comment on that?
I think it was just a general overall, feeling and discussion of the technical committee that first, if you do have the management changes that are kind of constant over time, it is a little bit easier to evaluate maybe if those management changes had something to do with it, because there are so many other things at play. But I think you're right. Once the final end is going to be, it's going to be what the stock assessment, when we update the assessment, if we've met the reduction, if the F is back to the target, it is going to be kind of, I guess it comes into play more if we don't reach our target, then you have to kind of try to figure out maybe what piece of the play is in play more, what piece of the changes have been most effective or not effective. Yes, I'm there.
And in addition, with the statistical catch-at-age, if you're changing your size regulations and everything like that from year to year to year, you're changing the selectivity of the fishery from year to year to year, and the model has a hard time trying to estimate those changes and tease out differences in abundance from differences in selectivity from year to year. So I think that was part of the structural concern with the difficulties of having a constantly changing management regime.
Tom?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Two questions. One is I saw and I agree in regards to the technical committee's concerns with the discards that may come with an increased size limit on the commercial. Speaking from the Chesapeake Bay, did the technical committee have any concerns with the increased discards related to increased minimum sizes on the recreational fishery? I say that because our data shows that if we go to a 20-inch fish, which is not the 25% reduction, that's 21, but if we go to a 20-inch fish, 45% of the 2011 year class is going to be less than 20 inches next year. There's going to be a tremendous amount of interaction with those fish, and there's going to be a high discard rate. And I was wondering if the technical committee shared those concerns on the recreational side as you did with the commercial side. Thank you.
Yes, we absolutely talked about those things, increases in the size and looking at the, from the MRIP data, what the lengths of the catches are. But once again, that's kind of hard to quantitatively put a number on because of angler behavior and just not being able to predict angler behavior moving forward. But yes, we did recognize that increases in size limits would more than likely increase some discards from the catch and release recreational fishery.
Follow-up?
Yeah, just to follow up, through our deliberation with the public over the last year, there's a strong sentiment that the striped bass population, and I'll use words that people often use, is on the verge of collapsing. Population is at that point where if we don't take action, we're looking at another moratorium. And as we heard earlier today, and I just see confirmation of this, yes, the population has declined, but in the technical committee's viewpoint, do you think that this stock is at a biological risk of collapse, or we're at a point where we're going to be seeing a higher level of recruitment failure? I'd really appreciate if you could respond to that question. Thanks.
Well, we kind of talked about this earlier relative to the year classes that have been produced at the SSB levels, and the technical committee recognized that the SSB levels we're currently at are still well above what they were in the 80s and early 90s, and well above what they were in 93 when it produced one of the biggest year classes in the time series. However, I think we also recognize that the overall trend has been declining, and if you look at the years in the mid-2000s compared to our current reference points, we were indeed overfishing several of those years. So I think the technical committee also recognized that if we have more year classes and bigger year classes produced and the stock increases, if there are no changes, if there's no reductions in harvest, then we'll likely be overfishing again as time goes on. But I don't think anyone feels on the technical committee that the stock is not able to produce big year classes as it is now. Like I said, the 2011 year class was fourth, fifth highest in the 82, in the stock assessment time period.
Emerson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Charlton. I have two questions. One is, I'm wondering if the technical committee had any discussion around the issue of the age data bias relative to calculating ages based on scales, and comparing those to ages based on OLS.
I've been on the technical committee since 2004, and we've been discussing that ever since I've been there. So yes, we have continued to recognize that there is a bias with the scales and the OLS. In fact, we just, and if I misspeak, Katie can correct me, but a few years ago, we sent around, this is relative to the paper that's been published recently about the bias with the scales OLS. We sent around scale and OLS to all of the states that age striped bass, because it's not just one state that does all the aging, so lots of states contribute to this. And we found that the biases in there are a little bit more not quite as easy to just explain in the paper. They're more than, so there are biases in between states, aging agencies. There's also a different bias with interannual ages depending on what the year class is. So it's not just one, we can just say, oh, there is a 15% bias across the board year after year, that these are, aging bias. And that's why the technical committee is really didn't feel comfortable in using an adjustment factor for those. I think that is ultimately the goal, the best we could do to adjust it. But right now, because of all the variations between the different agencies and the different scale readers and interannual variations, it would be something that you'd have to almost do every year and then make a correction factor for it. But we have discussed it and have talked about it at length.
So would the committee then recommend that the states start collecting more otolith-based age information?
Yeah.
Stock assessment report.
Yeah. So we have talked about we've talked about a lot. That is one of the recommendations from the stock assessment report. But of course, you have a much harder time collecting OLS, obviously, than you do scales. You're not going to want to sacrifice 25-year-old females on the spawning grounds to get at an OLS, I think, to tell whether she's 25 or 29 years old. I think the thing is the bias exists, and it seems to be pretty consistent, and we know the direction of the bias. It does have a tendency to cause F to be overestimated a little bit with when you're using the scales versus the OLS. But that has been one of the recommendations, and the technical committee and many other states have been spending a lot of time and money collecting OLS over the past 10 years where we can, without having to increase mortality on some of these bigger fish. And of course, you have the money constraint of moving to all OLS would be a larger monetary burden on the states and agencies.
My second question is relative to the comment that you made on the top of page 2 of your report, the caveat that an increase in size limits will require a change in the selectivity for the affected fishery in the next assessment update. Is that caveat in there because there would be an issue doing that, or just kind of to remind people that has to be updated in the next assessment? Would that pose a problem?
It's just as Dr. Drew pointed out, the more moving pieces that you change, sometimes the uncertainty increases. So right now we have selectivities that have been fairly constant through several assessment iterations. But you would have to, if as size limit changes, we just did want to point out that selectivities in the next model are also going to have to change, and that's just another little piece of the uncertainty that we just wanted the board to be aware of.
Mark Gibson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The question concerns the biomass target and threshold. This addendum and the action before us contemplates changing our F reference points to conform with the existing biomass target and threshold. There doesn't seem to be any quantitative examination of the reasonableness of the the two lines that we've seen drawn on the graph for so many sessions now. And I'm wondering, when is there going to be an opportunity to examine the biomass target and the biomass threshold? Does that require a benchmark assessment and a term of reference specifically addressing that? Is the technical committee already working on that? Those have been around the table for a long time, and they've already been identified, so I won't do it again. We recall that in the 1995 SSB level was a cause célèbre at one time, an achievement of rebuilding the stock in our movement from what were called transition fisheries under very low fishing mortality to full status fisheries. Somewhere along the line there was a reformation so that a line that was a cause for celebration and achievement has now become a threshold that we can never approach. And I must have missed a memo because I don't know remember the quantitative demonstration of where we needed to do that. It's already been noted several times here that, in sessions as well, that the largest year class ever in '93 was produced at an SSB level below that. The 2011 year class appears to have emanated from a SSB near the threshold, as has several other year classes. So I'm very concerned about those two lines. I understand we have a very difficult action to take today, and those are the lines that we have to work with. But my suggestion to the board is if those are the two lines we're left with, we're going to have a torturous management process for as long as any of you are going to be here trying to keep your SSB between those two lines. You're going to have very low fishing mortality rates, and you're going to have to hope that you don't get a string of not poor year classes, just a sequence of average year classes is going to take you below that threshold again. I'm certainly questioning the reasonableness of those two lines. And I hope that there's somewhere in the future, that's my question, are those going to be examined at any point?
So I don't know exactly when the 95 SSB abundance was chosen as the targets and thresholds, but they've been there, a long time, and that has been the biomass targets and thresholds, and they have remained at that. I think the biggest adjustment in this last assessment go-around was that the fishing mortality now has been more closely linked with that 95 biomass target, and it keeping it at the target and thresholds. But we have not done any further work that I'm aware of on recalculating a benchmark. I think that would have to come be a directive from the board if they wanted us to look at that.
Any other questions of Charlton? Okay, Martin?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know the board has previously extensively discussed the sex ratio issue. Some of the Bay states have brought up the issue of predominantly male fishery, up to 80% males. And I get a sense observing that a lot of the board members walk away with that, okay, there's some data that substantiates that, and there's an inequity issue. And I think that is part of it, but also I wanted to make sure the board was clear, and I'd like to see if Charlton would substantiate this. My understanding is the basis for that skewed ratio toward males, 80%, is because the females emigrate from the Bay earlier. The only study that I'm aware of is Rugolo and Jones, which does go back a ways, but does break it out by age, and does indicate at age 4, once they cross the exploitable threshold, only 22.8% of the females remain in the Bay. And that leads us to the 80-20, which has been brought up in recent data. So I think what I'd like to express to the board is, if we're going to reduce proportionally, what is the common sense in reducing proportionally on a population of females, if that's what we're trying to enhance, by 20%, and on the coast we have almost 100% females. So I guess my question, Charlton, is did you take this into consideration? Can you give the board members, the public, and the people that are listening in a sense of what the TC discussed with respect to sex ratios? Thank you.
Well, I can really just, we still don't have enough. I think the ultimate goal of the stock assessment, too, is to ultimately have the ultimate will be a sex-specific and stock-specific, reference point, some type of that into the model. That's been tried. The stock assessment subcommittee has worked really hard on that and just don't quite have the data to get it to that fine of a level yet. But I will substantiate what you said. You're correct about the immigration rates and the commercial fishery, or the fishery in the bay is majority males. But as far as an analytical, looking at the reductions from an analytical standpoint and the projections, the technical committee did not actually take in those two different sex ratios from the coast and the bay, because, like I said, we just don't have if they had that level, we could do it in the stock assessment.
Follow up, Martin?
Just a follow-up comment. The ramifications are significant, obviously. Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, Roy Miller.
At the risk of not forming this as a question, I just wanted to chime in that many of you will recall that, I guess it was about 7 or 8 years ago, the state of Delaware also submitted documentation to the board that their fishery in the summer was prosecuted on mostly males, and as a result, Delaware was able to have a slot limit during the summer months of July and August. So that particular scenario of differential sex ratios in the available harvest isn't exclusive to the Chesapeake, but also exists in Delaware Bay at certain times too. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for giving me that latitude.
You're welcome, and I hope people will minimize those comments, because clearly there's going to be the opportunity to make comments like that when we're making decisions here. Rob?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a return question regarding the statement about the 777 reduction and the effect management actions may have on that. And what I would ask is, isn't it the case that when the PDT worked towards the 2011 almost publicly released document, that one of the problems that was confounding the PDT at that time was the fact that there were different size limits and in different areas. We can't say producer and coastal as we used to, but that essentially is where the problem was. And now we've had an assessment that somehow incorporated those differences, so I'm having trouble thinking that that's a complication, and especially isn't it the case that with summer flounder, with the recreational fisheries, there are more changes over the course of a few years leading into last year than are almost imaginable, and yet that's a forward projection model, just a different model, but still a forward projection. So I guess I'm asking, how serious really are these management changes on the impact to be able to detect what current mortality rate is and current. I did. Okay, sorry. Okay. How much did you miss? My question is how much of an effect, Joe, you ready? Okay. How much of an effect really are management actions going to have, given that an assessment has already incorporated those different size limits and other management factors, and when we get to 2016, let's say, and there's an assessment update, will there really be that many complications if we have changes in regulations?
Well, so I can't speak to summer flounder at all, so I'm going to ignore that part of the question. And the issue you brought up between 2011 and 2013, you are correct that what has changed was the models. We broke the fleets out so that we had a Chesapeake Bay fleet that could account for the fact that the Chesapeake Bay is harvesting on smaller fish relative to what the coast is. So that allowed us to deal with a lot of that selectivity differences. And we also have different selectivity blocks to take into account when regulations went into place that changed the fish that were available to these different fisheries. It's not going to break the model to have multiple changing selectivities over time. It'll just increase the uncertainty about whether or not we have reached that target and that F.
Okay, seeing no further questions, why don't we turn to Kelly and the AP report?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. The AP met on October 15th. It was our first meeting face-to-face in a number of years. So as you can imagine, many of the AP members felt that, as typically they didn't have enough time, they were grateful for the face-to-face meeting. Mike Wayne probably deserves a trophy for herding cats. He had to lasso a few of us in occasionally, including yours truly, but at least he didn't have to draw on us as far as a pistol. It was a civil meeting, and rather than elaborate on all the plethora of points we went through, I think that Mike's characterization of the public comment that the advisory panel's meeting was more or less a microcosm of that public comment. So there are just a couple things I might briefly elaborate on that maybe Mike didn't get to. So anyway, thanks, Mike. They're looking forward to the next face-to-face meeting. But go ahead and take the first slide, which, as people might expect, recreational and charter boat, although I might qualify, it wasn't all charter boat. The charter boat industry does have different opinions within that, but by and large, they preferred option B, the adoption of the proposed reference points, and it should probably surprise no one that the commercial representatives preferred option A, and it says here, because the assessment uses flawed data, there are actually a myriad of different reasons that they felt that the option A was preferable, not because they were necessarily in love with option A, but because of different flaws. But that's a fair characterization up there. So the next slide, that there was support for option A regarding the Chesapeake Bay stock, that for status quo, that was also, you could pretty much expect from the Bay jurisdictions and the recreational as well, that the fact that the coastwide reference points, as we all know, don't incorporate a number of things, the most obvious being the male-female ratio of the Chesapeake Bay stock. Might be pointed out, too, that among a lot of disappointed comments regarding the failure to get the Chesapeake Bay reference points, that it was pointed out that not having it and using the SCA with the coastwide reference points is essentially a de facto reallocation of the striped bass resource from the Chesapeake Bay jurisdictions to other jurisdictions. So there is obviously a lot of disappointment. We've talked about that a lot. But on the other hand, and it was predominantly a recreational, especially from up north viewpoint, that they supported option B because they felt these coastwide reference points are, in fact, the best available science. And of course, there are sub-comments that say, yes, but that was by choice. And then other comments, once again, in rebuttal, but yes, but you can't help that. It is still the best available science. So there's a bit of an impasse on this type of thing. It is a significant and important conversation. I'm sure it will continue. But I think it's self-explanatory who was in favor of what. So for the next slide on 2.5.3, this is the Albemarle Roanoke River stock was one area that pretty much everyone on the advisory panel, much like the public at large, were fine with the continued management regime that North Carolina uses because of the discreteness of that stock, the lack of mixing with the other coastal stocks. So I think that's one thing that most everyone agreed on. So I think everyone should be happy about that. And number 2.6, as far as the timeline to reduce to the F target, pretty much the conversations were, again, a microcosm of what the board has talked about. Obviously, the majority, since the advisory panel is mostly recreational, favored reducing after the target in 1 year. They cite, for example, the direct empirical observations of the recreational fishery, that they're not seeing the level of success or the level of fish in most places. Yes, there are some counter observations from people that claim to be having great fishing, and I'm sure that's a function of things we don't need to talk about now, but the predominant view is clearly that the availability and the success of the recreational fishery has not been as robust as it should be, and consequently they don't want to delay. They're very clear that they would like to act now, and several people, most notably the New York recreational representative, pointed out a number of times that even with the most stringent option that we have on the table, there's only a 50% level or chance of success of reaching the targets. There are counter arguments to that, but that's one that we heard probably more frequently than others, and we'll leave that at that. As far as those in not favor of option B, reducing the F to the target within 3 years, I don't think it would be accurate to say that was just a commercial viewpoint. It was more of a Bay jurisdiction viewpoint, and very clearly the Bay jurisdictions feel that essentially they're being punished through proactive management, like when they took the 14% reduction, recreational and commercial, in 2013, unlike any other jurisdiction, plus the fact that they've been managing the Bay fishery through the harvest control model and the Bay-specific reference points very successfully, and has resulted in very successful emigration of not just good year classes, but all year classes to the other coastal jurisdictions. They're obviously, again, pretty upset about not having the Bay-specific reference points because the harvest control model has been so successful. A lot of people, of course, are concerned about the retrospective bias and the other flaws in the statistical catch-at-age model, especially now that we're using the coastal reference points under the SCA to manage a fishery that has been so successfully managed with the harvest control model. So that's why they're essentially, although there are other reasons, but in favor of option B to take a 3-year reduction in the target F. I'm assuming that you guys read all the public comments. There's no need for me to reiterate them. There are plenty of other reasons why certain people think the 3-year time frame is correct, but they're equally valid opinions of why it should all be done in 1 year. So, as usual, there's a bit of an impasse there. The commercial, of course, is concerned about the economic impacts to the industry. And there's also, that's not reflected in this report, a fair number of charter boat captains that are very concerned about this 1-year reduction of F. They feel like it will adversely impact their industry. And I did notice from the public comment, the letters that I think it was the Rhode Island Charter Boat Association, the Maryland Charter Boat Association, and other individuals in different states that contacted me also would prefer to see the 3-year, even though it's probably fair to say the majority of the charter for hire would be in favor of a 1-year reduction. And obviously the 3-year thing, as far as how easy it would be to adjust the trigger doing it over 3 years, that you still achieve the goal but don't cause the pain and suffering or whatever economic or social dislocations caused by the 1 year, which some see as stringent. Of course, on the other side, some see as absolutely necessary. And so that's why the general reasons why many people favor the 3-year. So on to number 3, the proposed management options. The PDT focused on, as you can see up there, taking the equal relative reductions from both commercial and recreational. We've discussed, and that's for the board, I think, to discuss the bag limit changes and the size limit changes. I will mention, like Mr. Gary and others have suggested, that and the technical committee, to be somewhat careful of changing the various size limits, especially under the statistical catch-at-age model, because when you start changing these baselines, apparently it makes the model less dependable. I think that's what Katie was getting at earlier, or Charlton, that you want to keep the same size limits as much as possible, just to compare apples to apples on an ongoing basis. And of course, you know, there was the same discussion, but in a lower sort of level of using the adjusted Amendment 6 quota allocations to manage the commercial fishery, but I think we've already gotten well past that. So on number 3, the proposed management program, as opposed to the options, As far as the conservation equivalency, I think the technical committee suggested that whatever conservation equivalent measures have been taken and used to manage whichever fisheries should be kept in place, probably to keep apples to apples comparisons over time. But that's always a bone that people, I suppose, will pick ad infinitum for the rest of time. But if, as you can see from the slide, that all states would need to resubmit their conservation equivalency programs for boards, and because money is not a big surplus among the states or in the federal government, the monetary challenges of having to resubmit things like that would probably speak toward keeping the conservation equivalency programs as they are, so we can keep the apples-to-apples comparisons. And it was, of course, has been brought out to you all repeatedly that states obviously can voluntarily implement more conservative management programs, and I think that's an important point. It's a basic point, but it often gets lost that the states always have that option. And then the next slide, option A, status quo. There wasn't much discussion of that. I think most people are well aware that for whatever reasons, the status quo is not tenable, either politically or scientifically at this point. So in option B, although there were people that thought that it should be that, only because of the dearth of good data to support the other options beyond the status quo. But on option B, as far as reducing the F in 1 year, obviously most sort of repeating this in a way, but obviously most recreational representatives supported that, especially for the recreational fishery. There was a minority opinion, but a significant minority opinion, to allow the charter for higher fisheries to have some sort of two-fish regime, because unlike most of the recreational fishery, there are a certain and significant number of charter representatives that feel only having one fish will significantly reduce the incentive of the people that charter trips with them, and will significantly hurt them economically, because in the calculation that people make whether to hire someone to take them fishing, one fish thing, to put it in one person's words, that won't even feed the family. So that was a significant, though still minority opinion, to allow that for the charter. As you can see, many people were in support of option B3. There are many comments that were made to this, but I think it's fair what staff put here, that multiple charter votes support the most conservative option. That does seem to be kind of a blanket statement that doesn't reflect the diversity of opinions and reasons for them, but as a generalization, I think that's accurate. And of course, this argument kind of was used in about two different directions. It can cut both ways, but they're talking about the economic impact issue. Some people want to have it considered that if we don't take action and we see, as I think Tom mentioned, the demise of the fishery, the economic impacts would be severe. On the other hand, there were those that made that counter-argument that we would see negative economic impacts if we reduce the recreational bag limit to only one fish, because people wouldn't be incentivized to fish as much, although that was distinctly a minority opinion, especially in the recreational sector. And as you can see, that many were in support of option B3. And I think that speaks for itself. On option C, to reduce F within 3 years, I think we've already essentially discussed that. One important thing, I think, while all of the commercial, a significant amount of the charter, and a minority of recreational thought, especially in the Bay jurisdictions, though, thought the various 3-year plans, whether it's the 777 or the 17%, were much wiser. A number of recreational representatives accurately pointed out, and I think the New York rep was most insistent, that I think it's Management Trigger 3 and Amendment 6 is very clear in pointing pointing out that action must be taken if, in this case, it was the Young of the Year index, if that trigger is hit, and we have 3 years below average, and the trigger was hit. Others feel that adaptive management that empowers the board to change that type of horizon to a 3-year time frame. So that went back and forth. You've already heard the arguments. They're the same as you've heard in the public comment. I will point out, since this ties into a comment Mr. Lustig made earlier, that, and this was not just commercial, though it was most of all the commercial representatives at the AEP panel, that there's a pretty strong perceived problem in the Bay with regard to carrying capacity. I know over the years some of the less sophisticated comments from some commercial people that, oh, the striped bass are eating all the crabs, that's why I don't have any crabs. That kind of thing has been scoffed at, and rightly so when it's put simplistically like that. However, there have been, as we know, a lot of scientific studies showing dietary changes in the striped bass diet that do show that not only has the diet been changing over time, obviously in response to various ecosystem and predator-prey relationship considerations, but that it is a significant issue. At this point, and as I see here, I was actually a person that brought this up in these words, that there could be a trophic collapse if the striped bass abundance increases. I don't think it was mentioned quite in that stark of terms, but because all of the commercial representatives, both on and off the record, were adamant that I bring up some of these carrying capacity issues. It's not in the Bay just that we've got these record Young of the Year that will be competing with each other for food, and I think any conservation biologist or textbook would tell you, whether it's sparrows, buffalo, or striped bass, if you have a record Young of the Year, you're going to have record competition for the same food resources. That's just kind of natural. The big issue, though, I think in the Bay is it's not just the interspecies, the competition within the striped bass Young of the Year for the same trophic level on the food chain. We've got an amazing abundance in the Chesapeake Bay of channel bass, puppy drum, redfish, and they are in the same trophic level. They're eating the same things. They're in the same thing all the way up into the freshwater, all the way down to the ocean. And I've never talked to anyone, regardless of how old, that's seen an abundance of redfish like we're seeing now. In some places, different fishermen, whatever they were targeting, say striped bass, they had to quit because it was nothing but drum. So we're concerned that these record high 2011 year classes, besides competing with themselves for the same food resources, will have stiff competition, not just from the redfish, but even more worrisome, the non-native blue catfish, and the two species of non-native catfish that are in the Bay, and probably coming to a river near you all, especially once we get a big hurricane, a lot of fresh water on the coast, they're likely to start getting into other estuaries. I hate to say that, because during a survey mostly oriented towards sturgeon and striped bass, we caught, even in areas that the blue catfish are not supposed to inhabit at all, salty areas, we caught more blue catfish by number and by weight than all the other species combined, and this is in an area that's not hospitable to blue catfish. I mention that because this carrying capacity, and I promised...
Kelly, can you...
Yeah, I'll wind that up.
Give the report, please.
Well, this is the thing that I was urged from all the representatives to make sure that without fail that I brought this up. So I'll leave it at that, but there's a big issue. Okay. Well, hopefully they'll be happy with that. And on the 20% reduction from the 2013 harvest as opposed to 2012, it was, as you see on the board, noted to be the most risky of the options as far as achieving the targets and thresholds. And as was mentioned before, even the most conservative option only has a 50% chance of achieving the targets and thresholds. So I think it was widely perceived by the recreational community that was already, and to some that was an unacceptable risk, only 50%. So to do it over 3 years was unacceptable to many, especially on the recreational side. As I spoke before, on the other issues, the charter for hire, says here they all supported D1. I think that was certainly the majority opinion. And you see on the board some of the other AP members supporting D2, D6. I'm not sure what the vote, numerically speaking, was for using the 2012 harvest and the 2013 for the Chesapeake Bay. I think Mr. O'Connell, Mr. O'Reilly, and Mr. Gary made their points very well, that basically 2012, if they take it from the 2013, it would be a de facto reallocation of fish from the Bay jurisdictions and would essentially punish proactive conservation risk-averse management. That's pretty much a universal opinion of the Bay jurisdictions. On the other hand, the recreational fishermen, especially those up north, felt that everybody should be held to the same benchmark, and for various reasons, some valid, maybe some not, they thought that to make an exception of a 2012 compared to 2013, they didn't think was appropriate. The commercial quota transfers, it wasn't a big issue. It wasn't real controversial. It very seldom comes up, but it's split along commercial recreational lines, and you can read the brief bullet points up there, and I think that's an accurate way to put that. On the commercial size limits, for the same reasons you've already heard, that commercial fishermen believe that those, and many recreational as well, believe those size limits, since everything's been calculated around that, everything from the conservation equivalencies to other aspects of the management plan. And so it's beyond just that it would be too much trouble to say change the size limits, but more substantively, the increase in discard mortality would be significant by doing that, and it would require industry not to only retool their gear and redo their fishing techniques, but there are a number of problems that I think anyone could envision that would come about. Most of those problems would accrue to the detriment of the stock, mostly in the form of discard mortality, which right now seems to be at a very low level, which is good news. Some of the recreational fishermen did not see it that way, and I think I've sort of, as chair, noticed that regardless of what position different people of different stakeholders are coming from, pretty much everyone wants to make the fishery in their own image. And so we'll always have those variances of opinion, and too often seems maybe they don't even reflect science, but they reflect the various positions of the various regional stakeholders, and I guess that's just the nature of it. I think just to general comments, which there were quite a few of, which Mike did a good job of putting up there, that on the only three that we've really singled out that I think have already been talked about enough, that 2013, the recreational sector generally thinks that 2013 should be the same benchmark that all sectors are held to. The commercial point out a number of different reasons that it shouldn't be, or the Bay jurisdictions, I should say. It's not a commercial recreational thing. Let me rephrase that. But certainly I think the Bay jurisdictions are unanimous, and probably recreational, commercial, and charter, that 2012 would be the only moderately fair baseline to set for the Bay jurisdictions. Other people outside the Bay jurisdictions feel differently, some of them. There was a fair amount of comment on possible triggers that will revert back to similar regulations we have now, depending on what those triggers were. That conversation, though, was not nearly as extensive as the one we had at this board in the last meeting. I think Mr. Foti brought up the possibility of sunsets or triggers. That's something for the board to discuss if they think it's appropriate. It was just something that we briefly discussed, pretty much reflecting the discussion of the board. And I was already stopped on the forage issue. And besides the trophic collapse issue, I'm assuming you all know the disease issues that accompany poor nutrition of striped bass, so that doesn't need to be elaborated on because I assume everyone's already done their reading. And I appreciate that. I'm sorry for elaborating on this, but I've just got to tell you, because I hear this from all the recreational and commercial members of the AP, there's a strong perception, probably always has been, that the board doesn't listen to the AP, and they would cite as evidence that we never have face-to-face meetings. That's why there's lack of participation and all that. There's some truth to that, but I think that most people on the AP recognize that the management board can only do so much, especially under the budget constraints that they have right now. So they were grateful for this face-to-face meeting, and I think you would see a much better participation as rate as well as a level of expertise in the advisory panel if there were more frequent meetings. And one other last thing in closing, I think it's important that the advisory panel be given access through direct email or snail mail or whatever to the same documents this board gets, because it was pointed out to me, and this was not a big issue with me, but I had gotten these documents, that things like the discussions and some of the emails have gone back and forth regarding the retrospective bias, the over or underestimation of F, or the spawning stock biomass because of the otolith versus scale aging issue, or other issues that might contribute to the retrospective bias of the SCA model, that the AP was not, a number of the members of the AP were not privy to those documents or to those discussions. And so it was pointed out to me to make damn sure that I brought to your attention that the AP is not always privy to the same information, and they would like to be. And I want to thank Mike for herding all the cats together and doing that meeting, because it is the first one they've had in a number of years. Thanks.
Thank you, Kelly, for that report. Are there any questions of Kelly from the board? Seeing none, Mr. Chairman, Lewis.
A question for Kate or Charlton that was precipitated by the very thorough report from the advisory panel. Talking about the only 50% probability of achieving the F target. All right, so get that in your mind. And then the bias from the scales. So the bias from the scales is making it look like the F's too high. But there's only a 50% probability of achieving the F. So based on the recommendations from the technical committee, y'all had to have taken all those things into consideration, but also looked at other biases associated with the stock assessment. And it would appear, based on those two facts, that actually the stock assessment is a little pessimistic as opposed to optimistic.
Yeah, I think that is the overall consensus, is that I think we recognize there is uncertainty and there's the potential for bias from a number of different sources, but that bias is leaning towards a pessimistic or a conservative bias. So unlike a lot of our species where we underestimate SF and overestimate SSB and think everything's great, striped bass has the opposite, where we tend to overestimate F and we tend to underestimate SSB. As we go forward, we know that this is a potential bias. It's not huge. It's not compared to the Menhaden retrospective pattern or some of the patterns you see in other species. It's not it's not enough to, I think, give the TC pause about the overall reliability of this assessment for management. But that is the direction of the bias that we see.
And just a quick follow-up, Mr. Chairman. So with that being the case, then that's pretty consistent with every assessment we deal with. There's some directional bias. There's some optimism or pessimism. So there's nothing really different here in this stock assessment that we don't deal with on virtually every stock assessment. And so the recommendation from the technical committee, as I understand it, is that we use the coast-wide estimate of F and the coast-wide reference points with a 1 year reduction of 25% to get us through get us through this down point as quickly as we can. Is that the technical committee's advice in a nutshell?
Well, we didn't necessarily pick a preferred option, but in going over, the versus the 1 year versus 3 years, yes, the 1 year will get us quicker to where we need to be and reduce the F target quicker.
Thank you.
Rob?
Daniel, the issue that Dr. Daniel brought up, I want to follow up on that. We talked about it before. I don't think, and I'd ask this question, is it really so simple that the technical committee concerning age determination knows there's bias and knows the direction? The reason I ask is there was a paper produced by Hank Lau of Old Dominion University, and maybe in companion with someone else, that did the conversion for scales and odorless. So one question would be, is that being used, or was that used in the assessment? I don't know. And a second question would be, Old Dominion University has collected about 300 companion odorless scale samples since 1998. Are other states doing that? Because where I left off in that process was the ASMFC was interested in age 10 and older fish. So have things changed for the better?
So that was what I was kind of alluding to earlier when I was talking about that paper. I was talking about the Hank Lau paper. So we discussed that quite a bit at one of the technical committee meetings. I believe it was probably before the benchmark assessment was even completed, but we discussed it a lot. And through that discussion, that's when we decided to send out scales and odorless to all of the different states and have them read them. And like I said, we found out that it seems like, one, the readers in those areas, because of their experience, have a tendency to be able to age their scales a little more accurately when you spread them out through the different readers from different areas. There's increased uncertainty. Also, there is interannual variation between the uncertainty. So that one study that Hank Lau and Dr. Nelson and Dr. Cynthia Jones, I believe, collaborated on, and Dr. Sheriff as well, they did find those percentages, but when we looked at it deeper and everybody looked at them, different scales from multiple years, we found that it was a little more complicated than that, and we couldn't just make one correction factor. I think that is the ultimate goal, and we have increased, the states have increased collecting of odorless and scaled combinations. We're continuing to do that. I don't have the actual numbers of how many have been collected per state, but every state is encouraged to do that and put them in the bank, put them in a reserve for future aging. But I think that's the goal, would be to possibly come up with a correction factor that can, based on that, is to correct that scale age bias, but we're just not quite there yet.
Pat?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We seem to be moving beyond questions to the advisory panel, and I'm prepared to start the conversation on moving forward with a motion if you're ready.
I am just about ready because, yes, we are ready to move on to the decision on this document. As I mentioned before, we have a decision tree in front of us that hopefully will help us move through this. Given just a reminder to the board, some of the Roberts Rules of Orders, I'll ask for a motion on these in a second, and I'll give the maker of the motion first shot at providing justification and comment on it. I'm going to go through, once we have a motion up there, I'd like to see hands of people who would like to speak on it. I will go through everybody at least once. If it seems like before I give a second chance, I'd like to see if the board could try to make their comments on the motion the first time that they are recognized. We are at 3 o'clock right now. We've spent 3 hours with good questions, of preparatory questions here, so hopefully we can move through this in a fairly smooth manner. So I'll recognize Mr. Kelleher first for the first motion here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. After listening to this discussion and getting to understand the public comments and the very thorough public comments and the other reports given and the questions given, I would like to make a motion to move the acceptance of option B under 2.5.1, option B under 2.5.2, and option B under 2.5.3.
Do we have a second? Dennis Abbott seconds it. Would you like to speak to it, Pat?
I'll just be brief. I mean, I think there's a clear problem here. We certainly have recognized it in the state of Maine and in the north for quite some time. Our fishery has been depressed for quite a few years now, and I feel it's now time to take action. And again, as I said earlier, I think when Mike Wayne started his presentation, he listed a very clear statement of the problem, and based on that, I make that motion.
Would anybody else like to speak on this motion? Speaking for or against?
Against.
Against? Yeah, okay. Is there anybody that's going to speak for it? Or should we? Yes, okay. Rob, you get first to speak against.
It's really a situation that what I'm really after is to get clarification. We heard some earlier on the reference points. I think we've come to realize for the Chesapeake Bay that there certainly has been some intractable situations. However, the only reason I'm speaking against is to get some better assurance. It wasn't clear earlier. What was said earlier, it could be a stock assessment or it could be working on the reference points. We can't do both. I want to make sure that within that or, there's still the possibility that the reference point calculations will be pursued. That's the reason for my objection.
Well, just for a follow-up on that, that is, as you know, is the primary agenda item on the next TC meeting, is the Bay reference points. Okay, I'll then go to someone who's in favor. Lewis?
Yeah, just believe that moving forward, as is overwhelming support from the public and the technical committee for option B under 2.5.1. Understand the angst on 2.5.2 with the Bay States, but understand that was the recommendation, I believe, of the technical committee and certainly the efforts from the commission to develop Bay-wide estimates. And under 2.5.3, I certainly support the Albemarle Roanoke management strategy. We're updating our assessment and taking action January 1 to reduce our quotas, so we're moving along in a rapid direction to reduce our mortality. So I would support the 3 option Bs.
Tom O'Connell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just think the current peer-reviewed benchmark assessment is an excellent model, but I think, as has been pointed out, the reference points are extremely conservative, to the point that Mark Gibson made before. I just look at the new reference points in regards to the spawning stock biomass as tracked over the past few years, and it looks to me that we're going to have to keep this at the stock at almost a unsustainably high level, and these are levels that we've seen in producer areas like the Delaware Bay that have caused serious declines in other managed fish species populations. I have harped on this point before about the ecological consequences of keeping the stock at this point. So once again, I just don't see the urgent need for us to adopt such a conservative set of reference points at this time. Thank you.
Dennis Abbott, 4.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the motion that was brought forward by Mr. Kelleher. And I think that at this point in time, we've surely heard a lot of discussion about this addendum. And I don't think that anyone's mind is going to be changed by furthering trying to make points with other board members. So I think that, we should just move along and vote on whatever motions are brought before us, because, again, I don't think that anyone will be changing their mind based on the public input and the reports of the technical committee and reports from the advisory committee. It's not going to change anybody's position.
I had one other person, and that's Paul Diodati.
Well, there's two problems with that, because I'm for the motion, and he was for the motion, and I'm also going to try to change people's minds. So do you want me to, would you like me to speak?
Is there anybody else that would like to speak against it at this point that hasn't already? Martin?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll just keep it simple. I am supporter 2.53, but they're bundled together, and my issue is with 2.51. So, and I concur with the comments that were made previously about Mark Gibson's comments. I just wonder, and I question, and I hope the board thinks hard about this, whether these reference points are even achievable. So I just go back to say I echo those sentiments. Thank you.
Okay, Paul?
Yeah, again, I'm in favor of this motion, and I really appreciate the uncertainty that the stock assessments, bring before us. They always do. Although this particular assessment, I think it's one of the best I've seen. There's tons of information in this stock assessment. There's not one piece of information. There's lots of information and a lot of analysis that's gone into it. But, I put aside all the questions about bias and age and what the reference point might do, and just look at the facts. Let's look at what catch statistics are telling us. In Massachusetts alone, since 2006 to 2014, our recreational catch has decreased 80%. That's already created the most significant economic impacts I can imagine on our recreational fishery. And it's not just the for-hire fishery. We're talking about the tackle shops, the boat manufacturers. Everything that I'm hearing about today, if we take any rapid cut, it might result in an economic impact. Well, where do you think we've been since 2006? We've taken some pretty drastic hits, and not to mention the hit that the stakeholders, the public, has taken in terms of lost public benefits from this resource. This is a tremendous fishery. I've seen it at its height after the recovery. There's nothing like it along the entire eastern seaboard. And I think it's clear that our management plan, Amendment 6, tells us exactly what to do when we're at the point we're at today. And actually, we're at this point 3 years ago, and that's when we should have taken an action. So I'm going to urge you all to take that action at this meeting, take the needed actions. And not only that, but I come from a state that has one of the largest commercial fisheries along the coast. I think New York and Massachusetts represent about 65% of the commercial harvest. Having said that, I recognize this as by and far a recreational fishery. The recreational fishery outweighs everything 9-to-1. And the recreational stakeholders, by and far, support us taking significant cuts today. And so I'm very much in favor of this motion. I thank Mr. Kelleher for bringing it forward.
Like a roll call vote? Are you okay? Ready to go? Okay, you speak against?
Kyle Schick. One thing that we've touched on, and I realize that we've had low catch, but we've also had the worst economy since the Depression. We've had one of the worst hurricanes in history. The East Coast has been battered by everything that life hits us with. We can't say because we've had lower catch that the problem is we need a higher biomass or that we need lower mortality rate. We've had lower biomass and have had great reproduction processes from it. I don't see the high urgency to do such a drastic measure at this time. I understand that we need to do something, but just because this is the trophy fish of our management plan, we've got to wave the flag and say, we've got to stop it this year. We don't have to stop it in 1 year. We don't have to do such a drastic thing over 3 years. We do need to do something, but I don't think that the economic impact that this is going to catch, and recreational fishermen, they don't want to go to one fish. They don't want to have this huge catch reduction. They may talk about it now, but we'll see what happens. Right now we've seen marinas have been going out of business, highest rate in history. Same thing with tackle shops. It doesn't have anything to do with the lack of catching rockfish. I can tell you that right now. So that statistic is way off.
Okay, Mark, are you for or against?
I'm for.
Okay, for.
I support the motion. I think it's consistent with the FMP and the addendum we have now. But I concur, I guess I concur with Paul that there is a rich database, not only the coastwide stock assessment, but many individual river systems, the juvenile indices and indices of spawning stock biomass, and I just encourage a more thorough examination of our biomass-based reference points for the future. But I concur with this action motion now. Thank you.
Okay, seeing no other, we're going to caucus, and we will take a roll call vote on this. Okay, let's vote on this. Mike, can you take a roll call?
Maine?
Yes.
New Hampshire?
Yes.
Massachusetts?
Yes.
Rhode Island?
Yes.
Connecticut?
Yes.
New York?
Yes.
New Jersey?
Yes.
Pennsylvania?
Yes.
Delaware? Yes. Maryland?
No.
DC?
No.
Potomac River Fisheries Commission?
No.
Virginia?
No.
North Carolina?
Yes.
National Marine Fisheries Service?
Yes.
U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service?
Yes.
That's it.
Motion carries 12-4. Okay, we've checked off number one on the decision tree here. We're now going down to section 2.6, timeline to reduce F to the target. Do we have a motion? Paul Diodati.
Point of order, I think. Yeah, point of order first. I think you said it was 12-4. I think the vote should be 11-4. I counted 11. Just ask you to...
Just double check. Got 12, okay. I wonder who the hell we missed.
Okay.
No matter.
Paul, we all got 12 up here.
Okay.
All right.
Okay, 12-4. Okay.
And I'm still ready to
Are
go
you
forward.
still ready?
I just want to make sure what type of motion that what topic was it?
We're on section 2.6, timeline to reduce F to the target.
Okay, I have a motion for you. I would move to reduce F to the target within 1 year with the 25% harvest reduction.
Second.
Seconded by David Borden. Would you like to speak to that motion?
it's consistent with the addendum, and I think that the alternatives of taking 17% or taking the phased-in approach of 777, the comparisons are too far off. 7% reduction means that you're still fishing at an 18% higher rate in year one, about 11% in year two. So by the time you catch up, I think you've done considerable impacts on both the 2011 year class, which we haven't seen in abundance yet on the coast, and other members of the spawning stock biomass. So I think it's important to move forward quicker, and this is the way to do it.
Okay, I'd like to take a show of hands of who would like to speak on this. First of all those who want to speak in favor. Rich, E, and Pat, right? Mark. Sarah Peak. And Lewis. Okay, all those who would like to speak against the motion? We got Rob. Dan. Tom. Marty. Okay, since I will go to those against first. Rob O'Reilly, you're first on the list.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And what I'm really going to be after is an amendment, so shall I wait until there's comment on this motion?
Is it an amendment or a substitution? It's an amendment.
It is an amendment.
You're more than welcome to take it right now, and then we'll take up discussion on the amendment.
Thank you. I would like to amend the motion by substituting 3 for the word 1 and make it years instead of year, and after the words with either a 17% reduction or a tiered reduction of 7% for 3 years. And I'll give some commentary on that if that's okay.
Is there a second? John Clark. Okay, go ahead and you speak to the amendment.
I'm amazed at what I have heard in the last 20 minutes because it's accurate, but it's very colloquial. It speaks of the recreational fishery, which is a powerhouse. The recreational fishery may not be 9 out of 10, but it's probably 7.5 or 8 out of 10 in terms of the two fisheries. So it is a powerhouse. Generates a lot of economy. The coastal states value the recreational fishery. The Bay jurisdictions value the recreational fishery, but there are differences. The principal difference for wanting to go for 3 years is that we do have small fish in the Bay. After all, in Amendment 5, the reason that it was a 20 and 28, with the Bay taking 18 inches and taking a 4% penalty, was in recognition of the small fish. These small fish include what Tom O'Connell mentioned, that in 2015, 45% of the 2011 year class will be under 20 inches. The small fish are not only part and parcel of commercial fisheries, but also of recreational fisheries. There are certainly areas in Virginia where all they see are small fish. The distribution is just that up in our northern neck, which is 5 counties. So I think that one problem I have with giving everything to the recreational fishery is that in the Bay, we do more or less have a split 50-50 of commercial and recreational. Along the coast, it's not the small size limits. It's not the small fish. There are really dramatic differences in what's available to fishermen. And I think along the coast there are 4 states without commercial fisheries, and this is a commission, and every state has the ability to make its voice heard. But there is somewhat of a difference when you're looking at a number of states who do not have both a commercial and recreational fishery. That should be something that's thought about. On the commercial fishery in the Bay, we have either ITQs or ITWQs, meaning a weight quota on an individual basis. This allows the harvesting of small fish, getting the right markets. It allows for the most efficient manner possible, and in Virginia, that's been 1998 on. Discards. How are we really going to protect the 2011 year class if there's such things as bycatch and gear interactions and other fisheries throughout the year? How do we protect that 2011 year class, really? Some of the conversations that have had are talked about things such as wading through the 2011 year class to get your larger fish and leaving a wake of discards. Discards don't seem to resonate this time around, but in 2011, it was one of the biggest rallying cries. There was a 65% drop in the B2s since 2006. I agree with Mr. Diodati. I thought something should have happened in 2011, but that was when the 2011 year class was just hatched. Now the 2011 year class is in the fishery, in the bay. Minor amounts will trickle through to the coast starting at age 5. So there's a big difference now. The last thing I want to mention, and it's certainly not comprehensive because we all hold our fisheries close to our heart, but the idea of the ecosystem balance, which you heard earlier, both from Mr. Hinman and from Mr. Brown. It's not the same throughout the coast and the coastal states and the bay. There are differences. Blue crab in the Chesapeake Bay is an $85 million harvest. Do small blue crabs get preyed on by striped bass? Yes, they do. What Mr. Place had indicated about the puppy drum or the small red drum that filtered through the Chesapeake Bay in 2012 and now, thank goodness, have found somewhere else to go because they reached the 3-year-old stage. All that is an impact for us. And frankly, if the flagship of the ASMFC is striped bass, what blue crab has been called is the iconic species of the Chesapeake Bay by our governors previously. So it's all a matter of difference. It's all a matter of where you sit, reside, fish, everything else. But I urge you to consider the differences. Otherwise, when we started out in 1994 to finish up the plan for Amendment 5, we wouldn't have parceled out the allocation, the size limits, and everything else the way we did. Thank you very much.
All right. On the underlying motion, or the original motion, I had the following people speaking in favor. I want to see if you all want to speak against. I had Bill Adler. Do you want to speak to this motion? I'm going to go through a list. I'm going Bill Adler, Richie White, Pat Kelleher, Mark Gibson, Representative Peaks, and Louis Daniel. Are these all people that would like to speak on this motion? Yes? Yes?
I wanted to speak in favor of the motion, not the amended one.
Okay. But, so, and are you want to, do you want to speak in favor or against this motion? This motion, in favor or against?
It's difficult to say, but I want to explain New York and New Jersey's and Delaware's producing areas, because we kind of forget this in the conversation.
So you don't know how you're going to, whether you're speaking in favor. I'm just trying to get a quick count here of who wants to speak. And I know I'm going to say, Yep. That's what I'm trying to, assuming that everybody that was against the underlying, well, we wanted to speak for the amended. Am I correct? Okay.
Okay.
So now we've had someone speak in favor, so Richie White was the next person on my list to speak, in this case, against the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to speak against this motion. A clear, overwhelming majority of the public would be against this motion. The technical committee would be against this motion. The law enforcement committee has come out for 1 year, which would be against this motion. I believe that this comes down to the credibility of the commission. When we passed Amendment 6, we said that if a trigger was exceeded, we would react to it in 1 year. And now we're saying, oh, gee, we don't have to do it. We can do it in 3 years. And I was certainly here when we voted Amendment 6, and I feel I gave my word to the public at that time. And I think it's important that we live up to our word. And we should vote this down and vote the original motion in. Thank you.
All right, the next person I have for this motion is Dan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll share with you all a little bit different perspective. As a representative of one of the Bay jurisdictions, we don't have a commercial fishery in D.C., so I'm approaching this from a recreational angle. But just to expound a little bit on what Rob was talking about, the fishery that we see in the district is vastly different than what you see on the coast. While we do see those spring migrants, we're always more than willing to protect those spawning females that are going to most heavily impact that SSB. But at the same time, the remainder of our fishery in an urban setting where it's all shorebound anglers, those anglers are targeting the fish that are there, which are all primarily 18 to 20 inches. So by going with the 1 year reduction, we will effectively eliminate the striped bass fishery for our shoreline-bound anglers. By going to a 777 approach, we would be able to conservatively use that 2011 year class of predominantly male fish that are not going to significantly affect the SSB. And we would still be able to maintain our fishing license sales. We would still be able to maintain a populace that can enjoy this recreational species that everyone along the coast loves to enjoy, just at a larger size. So that's the perspective from DC, and that's why I would like to support the three-year plan. Thank you.
Okay, on the against, I have Pat Kelleher next.
I'll be brief, Mr. Chairman. I just mirror some of what Richie White said earlier. The issue for me comes down to the lost economics or the lost economic benefit that this fishery once had in the state of Maine. Our overall catch and harvest is down 75% since 2006. It's time that, again, as Mr. White said, to honor our commitment to the resource and to the majority of the public who have clearly stated that it's time to take action on this matter.
Okay, Tom O'Connell, for.
Yes, speaking for the motion. It's been a long year on developing this plan, and as I've gone out and talked to a lot of people about this, talked to several of you, and recognizing the complication of it, I reflected on the strategic plan that we all agreed upon last fall at this annual meeting. And in that strategic plan, it listed a set of values that we are to collectively use in making decisions. And when I ever face a complicated decision, I try to go back and look at those values. And I hope all of you had the chance to look at the Chesapeake Bay White Paper and look at those values from a personal standpoint. You know, I know a lot of us come into these meetings with representing our state interest, but we are also a collective body that has agreed to make those decisions based upon those values. And we heard our chairman last night talk about that strategic plan. We also heard John Bowl, the regional director of Garfo, talk yesterday about jobs and food and recreation. I think as we look at this option, you know, we really have to ask ourselves whether or not a one-year plan is going to live up to the values that we agreed upon a year ago. I respect Paula's viewpoints and others from Maine, but let's look at the science. We know for certain that the bay's fishery is predominantly males. I think it's misleading to think that a major cutback in the Chesapeake Bay summer, fall, winter fishery is going to benefit the state of Maine. Most of those females are out of the bay before our fishermen even get access to them. We know that there's a distinct sex differentiation, but it's not being accounted for in the reference points we just adopted. When I looked at the stock assessment that looked at the fishing mortality by fleet. Why have we been overfishing the last 6 to 10 years? Look at the fishing mortality for the Chesapeake Bay fleet. It's been stable. It's because of the reason that Rob O'Reilly mentioned. We've been monitoring that fishery very closely. We've been responsible, keeping that fishery in line with the exploitable stock. The coastal fishery alone has exceeded the F target in 6 of the last 10 years. The coastal fishery alone. Yes, are reductions needed? I think they are. They're needed mostly on the coast. We're willing to take a reduction on our fisheries that interact with those females. The coastal fishery, our spring trophy fishery, that's where we can make a big difference. We're willing to take some adjustments in the Chesapeake Bay fisheries while we await the findings of the Chesapeake Bay reference points. The interim reference points were very close to being supported by the technical committee. We're going to demonstrate that the reduction in Chesapeake Bay was going to be less than the 25%. Pat Augustine made an incredible speech today. We all want to represent our constituents, but we all are here to make the right decision. We had eels earlier this week. If we want to follow the technical committee advice, we should have done it for eels. A depleted resource, and we supported a motion, and I did too, for all the right reasons, to allow Maine to harvest 200% more than the technical committee's recommendation. 200% more for a depleted resource. I also ask all of you to reflect on those values. Bay fishermen has been making sacrifices for the last decade. We're asking for a fair plan. Thanks a lot.
Next on the list for 4, I have Mark Gibson. Against the motion, Mark Gibson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm opposed to the amendment primarily because it allows for the 3-year 7, 7, and 7 combination. I could be convinced to support the initial motion at 17%. But the 3-year 777, I think, is simply not a credible option given the amount of management uncertainty and scientific uncertainty we have in the stock assessment between translating promulgated regulations down to where the rubber hits the road and F reductions. Management uncertainty is going to swamp out any ability for that to be a meaningful option, in my view. And the scientific uncertainty, the stock assessment is not going to be able to detect changes in fishing mortality on the order of those small increments. And allowing regulation to creep over time, over a 3-year time, is going to complicate the assessment. It's now again, a statistical catch-at-age model. We have to make assumptions about selectivity blocks. That option will compromise our scientific assessment. So the possibility of that option forces me to oppose the amendment. Thank you.
Martin, you're up next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just 2 quick comments. We're in a timeline now, so at this point, it's really a matter of how soon we get there. If we look at this amendment, I'm obviously speaking for it. We have an option to get there in a little bit more time. And I think the theme you've heard from the Bay States is the impacts that it's going to have socioeconomically to the charter boat captains, to the tackle shops, to the commercial fishermen. But we're going to get there. It's going to happen. And I remind you, the stock assessment indicated overfishing is not occurring, the stock's not overfished. But we're in a precautionary mode. Nobody's denying that we're seeing fewer fish. But this is a timeline. So I'm not sure. I do understand the recreational pressure that's being brought to bear. And I do understand the polarization that's occurring. But my final comments kind of tag on to what Tom O'Connell just said, and I certainly couldn't say it as eloquently, I think, as he did. But I will ask you to look at this more holistically and search back and see where the genesis of all of our travels have come from. And I think the starting point for a lot of us, I know it certainly is for me, is the moratorium. I was hired in 1985 at the Maryland Department of Natural Resources, the year the moratorium was instituted. Great time to start a career. But since then, imagine where we've come. I know at that time when I was hired, I thought if the fishery even opened during the time I was employed and I was working in the field, I thought it'd be a great achievement. 5 years later, it opened up, and then the rest of the story is pretty well known. Meteoric rise, and then stock leveled off. And we've had our ups and downs, especially since the mid-2000s. This isn't the first iteration of this kind of discussion based on concerns of the health of the stock. It's not the first. But what the work of this commission has, and all of its supporting bodies, its advisory bodies, the staff that works here, everyone that's involved, the one thing they've been able to do when they're faced with these challenges is they've been able to compromise. And that's really, I think, what you're hearing from the Bay States now. Look, I've only been on the board for about a year and a half. I'm pretty novice. I've been a biologist for 30 years, but it's my first opportunity to sit with you all, and it's a great privilege. But I will tell you this, the predecessors and a lot of you that have been on the board have worked through these types of issues, these challenges, through compromise. And that's the reality where we are right now. So I would plead with you, literally plead with you, and challenge you. Because I know, I've talked to several of you, and I know walking in, I did the math. Those northern states that are being driven by the recreational constituencies have the votes. You've got them. We don't. So this is the olive branch. This is the middle ground. This is your opportunity for those of you that want to reach out and compromise like our predecessors have done. And remember, all the work that this board has done, its staff, since the moratorium, out of the abyss of the moratorium, we've enjoyed a quarter century of good recreational, commercial, and charter fishing for this species. Let's continue that good work, and I would challenge you all, this is the olive branch. Take it or refuse it. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Representative Peaks, you are the next on my list.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Maybe because I'm a legislative commissioner on the commission, I really hearken back and give great weight to some of what Richie White had to say relative to the importance of public comment. You know, we voted on and put out a very complex document for public comment. It's so complex that today, thank you for preparing this cheat sheet so that those of us who voted on the various aspects of this document can know exactly what's in here at a glance. I'm not sure that we would be able to follow along or be where we are even at this hour of the day if we didn't have this cheat sheet. The point being, this is a complex document with lots of options in it, yet the public took time to review it, to show up at hearings. As a colleague earlier said today, maybe not in the numbers we would have liked to have seen, but it's a different world today. People communicate through email and through letter writing as well, and I think if you look at the totality of those public comments, it was something very significant. And we shouldn't turn our back on that. The public has expressed that they have a sense of urgency about this, not a 3-year time, let's phase it in, but people who are out on the water, recreational and commercial fishermen, say, we are seeing a change in what has been, and I've used this phrase with my colleagues in the Massachusetts legislature, the poster child for good and excellent fisheries management. So I think we have an opportunity today to live up to our our generational responsibility to do what's right and maybe make the tough decision today so that we're making that investment for future generations. And it's for that reason that I oppose the amendment and stand in support of my colleague from Massachusetts in the underlying amendment. Thank you.
Kyle, you are next on my list.
I agree. We do have to make some changes. We have to modify this, and I think the 1717 is the option to go. That's my personal opinion. I think, you know, when we talk about this quote-unquote overwhelming public opinion, how many millions of people fish for rockfish, and what percentage said something? And what percentage of those people that said something that didn't get some organization cram a letter down their throat and send a form letter back to you? You're talking a very, very minuscule part. And they can hand up posters behind my back and wear hats and do everything they want to do. It's a minor, minor part of the fishery that spoke. This board has a duty to do what's right, and to do what's right for the entire region, not their self-serving interests, and not because of political pressure, but because what is right. And to try to take fish from the Chesapeake Bay region that will never make it north is wrong. It's not serving anybody. And like I said, if you think that we've had marinas and tackle shops go out of business since 2007 recession, wait till you go out and buy tackle so you can catch one fish, so you can catch a fish that doesn't exist. We don't get those fish in the northern neck of Virginia. We get them, you know, in the fall, we get them in the spring. We've conceded that we're willing to work with that. We're not inflexible. We want to be able to make sure that New England gets the fish that they need. And guess what? Male 18-inch to 22-inch fish aren't what they need, and they aren't going to get them. We can change that. They're still not going to get them. What they need and what they can get is the fish that we cannot catch early in the year and late in the year. And we're willing to do that. And, you know, like Marty, so you eloquently put it, we're willing to offer that olive branch. We have. We've talked about that for a year, but we've got it snapped back in our face like a briar patch. And I really think we need to do what's right, not what's popular or what is perceived to be popular, because that's who's barking at your feet when you go to work in the morning. Thank you.
Louis Daniels, I have you on the list next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess I really don't see it as an olive branch, because this takes the entire coast to the tiered approach or the modified approach as opposed to the 1 year. So I think that there was some discussion earlier on, maybe sidebars, about handling the bay differently. But this handles the entire coast as a single unit stock, and I can't support that. I think that the technical committee advice, you know, is clear and peer reviewed. I don't necessarily agree with the comment about the 200% increase in Maine's glacial fishery, because that was a recommendation, or that was a statement that came from the technical committee at the 12th hour of our discussion points, and I don't think that that was a fair assessment personally. But in this situation, I do believe that we made a commitment in Amendment 6, and we need to stick to that commitment. Now, if there's some option that's out there that the board can support that could provide for some options in the bay, you know, that's up to the board. But for the coastwide stock and protecting those big older female fish, in my opinion, it's critical that we get these reductions in 1 year and we reduce the recreational harvest on those big fish. Thank you.
John Clark, you were the next on my list.
Thank you, Doug. A lot of the points have been made very well by the Chesapeake representatives. I just want to say that I think it's a matter of perspective as to how you see this. I certainly understand the concern from New England about the lack of fish they're seeing up there, but I think the Delaware is similar to the Chesapeake in that we've seen huge numbers of small fish. A lot of resident fish. Our slot fishery that Roy alluded to, where we are fishing on resident male fish, we've seen a 150% increase in the catch. This is only prosecuted during the summer, yet the number of trips has only gone up 7%. I mean, we have a huge number of striped bass. I think they will be coming and recruiting to the coastal population, not these resident males, but a lot of the other small striped bass we're seeing in the Delaware. I think we're already at the point where in a few years we will see a increase on the coast, and I just think going with the 3-year or the 17% in 1 year would allow us to take a little more of a go slow approach to these reductions, because just from what we see from our perspective, we think things are changing for the better as of now. Thank you.
Paul Diodati, you're next on my list.
Yeah, obviously I'm not in favor of this motion for similar reasons to what Lou Daniels articulated, that I just don't view this as a proper alternative. I don't view it as the olive branch that you want it to be. And I have a lot of respect for everyone around this table, but particularly some of my colleagues in the Bay. We've worked together now a number of years, and so I recognize the difficult position you're in, and and I agree with some of the facts. And some of the things that I spoke to were facts. For instance, the proportion of commercial versus recreational. The harvest coast-wide is actually about 26 million pounds recreational, about 3 on average over the past 10, 15 years in the commercial side. So that's pretty close to a 9-to-1 ratio, and that's without even accounting for the catch-release fishery, which the rec fishery is all about. The stakeholders I've talked to, and it's got nothing to do with what's popular today, or I've been doing this for a while, and I know what people want, and I can see the writing on the wall. I've had 4 public hearings in my state. I attended them all, and there was an overwhelming opinion on what pathway we need to take. And so, clearly, in this case, it's relatively easy for me to go in the direction that I'm going. But I can tell you right now, I very often don't go the easy political route. In this case, I'm not sure that this is the easy political route for me, and I'll hear about that later. But you also mentioned there's the risk of release mortality on the 2011 year class, and if I've learned nothing, I know that the 8 or 9% that we might result in mortality on the release part of it is a lot safer than the 100% that you get when you harvest those fish. So I can live with that. I can't support this motion. I wish there was something else that we can talk about, and that I've tried to talk about that with some members of the Bay over the past months.
All right, I have 5 other people that raised their hand initially, and I'd like to sort of get a feel for whether they're going to speak for or against, so I can put them in the proper column. Tom Foti, you have sort of a neutral comment?
Yeah, it's more of a clarification on something that Bob said. And if you want me to, I can say it now.
Go right ahead, right now.
Yeah, I listened to the conversation from the Chesapeake Bay, and I listened to, how the producing area status. Well, New Jersey has 2 producing area statuses that we basically had. And I don't think any commissioners that's sitting around the table, maybe except for me, were here when we basically all of a sudden left the meeting and came back and found out that the producing area status of the Delaware Bay and the Hudson River was taken away. And that's not by the members of the commission that's sitting here now, but it was other members of the commission. and it's always stuck. So, Rob, when you start talking about, having summer fish and everything else and what goes on, I get in the Hudson River and I get the Delaware River, and parts of the up in the Brereton Bay and parts of the Delaware Bay have the same sort of situation. And I hopefully at one day we will revisit. Now, not that we're looking for special regulations, at some time maybe we are, but I would like to have the producing status at least recognized, since we are now producing a substantial part of what goes on in the coastal migratory stocks, and in my estimation more than we did 15 or 20 years ago. So I just like that recognition one day. And that's not to this motion, but when I hear that conversation going on, we kind of forget that we only have summer fisheries up in the Delaware River and the Hudson River on small male fish, the same as you do, and we give up the same thing. But we have the other disadvantage where we don't even recognize, so they're not made available to us. So I just wanted to put that on the table.
Emerson, were you for or against? Before you just...
Neutral.
I'll take another neutral one.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, I'm neutral, and I'm trying to perhaps find some common ground here or some common discussion. From our discussion this morning with Commission staff, it was pointed out that there's not a statistically significant difference between the three non-status quo options in terms of getting us back up to the threshold. Statistically, they're the same because of the variance around running those models. So from a statistical perspective, I don't see any difference between the original motion and the substitute motion. However, relative to the motion we passed however many minutes ago it was on the reference points, the footnote there is that the target and threshold, the F target and threshold values may change through updated stock assessments because they are estimated based on best available data. And Jim Gilmore raised that issue this morning, and I believe the response was that if we go with a one-year option, then when we do this updated stock assessment in 2015, we may be able to come back, reassess this in terms of where we are and where we might go with fishing mortality limits. The other issue is relative to what we're discussing right now, the two timelines. There's a highlight in the document that says, if the board selects option B, which is a 3-year time frame, the board may choose management measures from either the 1-year or the 3-year time frame options in section 3. So that allows us in the next discussion, or it's not the next one, subsequent discussion, to choose options from either 1 or the 2 3-year options. Thank you.
All right, I still have a number of lists, and I'm just trying to get an idea of who's going to speak for and against. Russell, I saw your hand, and you're for this motion. Mitch, are you speaking for or against? Neutral. Dave Simpson, for or against? Rob, are you for or against?
I'm happy to have all this public comment, Mr. Chairman, and there's been enough comment that I will follow.
I asked you a question. I want to give people a chance to discuss it. I understand where you may be going next.
Okay. So I
want to give everybody at least a chance.
I'll be neutral now and wait for my turn.
Okay, thank you. So based on those things, I'm going to go to Russell, who is the next person that's for this.
I've been a commercial fisherman for 55 years in Maryland, and I've watched the striped bass come and go. And at this time, we probably got more striped bass in the bay than I've ever seen in my life. We got so many striped bass that it has affected our crab catching industry. We are probably down to a low ebb last summer on crabs. And one of the predators is rockfish, striped bass. when striped bass, when the charter boats catch the striped bass and they clean them, you can count anywhere from 10 to 40 small crabs in the belly of a rockfish. This also would hurt our charter boat industry, which in my hometown, Tillman Island, we have a large charter boat industry. And if you restrict them from 2 fish to 1, they're going to have a hard time drawing customers from Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, wherever, to catch 1 small fish. Believe me, we have bukus of fish. Those fish, those 3-year-old, 2-year-old, and now we have a new class that's maybe 8 to 10-year-old coming. Those aren't going to get up to New England. And we're punishing the bay for catching big fish that we didn't catch. Those fish were caught up the coast. They overfished that fishery, the large fish, for the last, as Tom said, 7 out of 9 years, but yet the bay is going to be punished for it when we got bukus of small fish. We need this to help our industry, the charter boat industry, and the commercial fishing industry and the sports industry to kind of work in this at a slow pace, at the 7% a year. So that's why I support it. Thank you.
Bill Adler, you're against?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A lot of my comments have already been covered, so I won't go over them again, other than the fact that I know something must be done. Also, when I looked at the comments from not just our state, but from the overall comments, they were overwhelmingly in favor of the 1 year, and this wasn't just my state. The majority, the TC had indicated that they're going to have a problem if we go with something other than this, and of course we need the TC information to work on the future. I also just want to throw out the idea that if the 25% did pass, I'm not sure whether the conservation equivalency wording in the document might be able to be taken by the Chesapeake Bay people to adjust something to make it a little bit better for them. So I don't know about that, but that came to my mind. So one smaller thing actually was when when the charter boat people in our hearing got up and said, look, just get it over with, because I can't change the rules of printing and everything else every year, because you're gonna change a rule this year and then again next year and then again next year. I know this isn't a very big thing, but it was an interesting piece of information. If you're going to do something, do it, get it over with, and then we'll move on. And once again, for the Chesapeake Bay, I do think that I'd like to see some way to help them out. But the overall thing from everything I've read and all my all the 90% of the people I got written information from, and they were separate things. We're all in favor of this one, so I'm opposed to the amendment.
Mitch, you have a neutral?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Like some of the other speakers before me, I would love to see a compromise here, something that could accommodate the Bay States, but still also recognize the majority of public support, including the support of the recreational fishery, that although their numbers may have come to us because some organizations have organized them and brought them out here and got a lot of people to sign form letters and petitions. The fact is that getting people to sign petitions and form letters and show up for meetings really is an important way to demonstrate a constituency's passion about any interest. So I really do respect the fact that so many folks have come to the meeting to express their view, even if it is only a selective part of the overall population that is fishing on striped bass. That being said, I'm very hopeful that we can have a compromise here, and I, for one, could not support this amendment because it would allow states up and down the coast to back off of the one-year implementation of the new rules. On the other hand, I could support, I would support if the Bay States offered the amendment in a different way by suggesting that the Bay States would be permitted to implement the only a 17% reduction in the first year. So with that said, I invite my colleagues from the Bay States to modify the motion to make it more palatable to a greater number of the commissioners who, from what I'm hearing, might also be supportive of such a compromise. Thank you.
All right, I have two people that have not spoken that want to speak against the amendment. I also have Rob O'Reilly, which I suppose wants to speak in favor of the amendment, but you've already spoken once. Is there anything significant and new that you want to make that isn't something you previously made in favor of this amendment? Rob?
I'm in the presence of legislators, so I assume that the motion is owned by the board, and if that's the case and there's a vote up or down, then there'll be another motion, because what I'm hearing around the table is something that's at least supporting the idea that we could have some type of an approach where the Bay and the coastal fisheries could have some different reduction regimes.
I'll next go to Dave Simpson against this amendment.
Thanks, Mr. Chair, and that's where I'm hoping we can end up here. I can't support this motion because of the 3 years, 777. Mark Gibson made that comment probably 40 minutes ago, and I believe that. I think we need to recognize that the Bay has been actively managing their fisheries, where we've been on autopilot at 28 inches and 2 fish for a number of years now, and clearly the coastal states, as everyone said, are feeling these big reductions, and I think there's a lot of support for substantial changes to management, perhaps going to 1 fish. So I think Rob is suggesting that the more expedient thing to do would be to vote this up or down. Presuming it fails, hopefully someone from the Bay States are prepared to provide an alternative motion that could get us to the where we want to go, which I believe is where coastal states are willing to do a little bit more. The Bay States could do something in 1 step that's short of the 25+%.
All right, Bill, are you for this amendment? Okay, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. More specifically, I want to make a statement in support of phasing in general as a tool for fisheries management in circumstances where you don't have biological urgency. And I think the history of this commission supports phasing as a tool, generally speaking, under those circumstances as well. And the one example I'll invoke was about 12 years ago when we were faced with great concern about the coastal intercept fishery for American shad being one of the only directed fisheries left, and one that was widely recognized as being unmanageable because there was a mixture of stocks, including the remnants of many runs up and down the coast that were being targeted together. So we had pretty much unanimity that that should not exist as a fishery because it's unmanageable. But what did we do? We phased that fishery out over 5 years. And I think, as I said, that speaks to how we have, over time, recognized the validity of phasing of major decisions to as good management and as lasting decisions. In this case, though, we do have some socioeconomic urgency. I don't want to diminish that, up the coast especially. So I think we need to address it. We need to take action. I do think we need to manage expectations there a little bit, though, because the decline we've had over the last 10 years has been a decline from an all-time high in biomass. And do we expect to be able to maintain this stock at or near that level on an ongoing basis? I don't think we do. So I don't think we're going to be able to recoup all of that socioeconomic impact up the coast, but we certainly have to have a sense of urgency for addressing as much of it as we can realistically. So I guess where I'm going with this is, can we take the more direct, more immediate action in a more focused way that it deals with that problem, and at the same time phase in those parts of the fishery where maybe it's not so urgent, and where, as we learned earlier this morning, we really don't have a biological urgency. And so I would suggest that if there's a way to do it, and I'll defer to some of others of you around the table to find this way, but if there's a way to do it, can we take action in 1 year on those parts of the fishery that are focused on the spawning stock, and phase in what action we take on those parts that are not? Thank you.
The last person on my list before we vote will be Adam Nowalski.
Thank you. I need a clarification on this, in that as the motion is written, I understand substituting 3 words, and then it says either 17% or a tiered 7%, which to me, as we move into Section 3, means selecting only from options C or D. When in the addendum, option B for the time frame, if we selected the 3-year time frame, said that we could select from any of the 1 or 3-year options. So does this amendment effectively take out the option Bs in Section 3 or not?
And my interpretation is yes, because it specifically says we'd use those 2.
Hearing that, I move to substitute option B, a 3-year time frame, with the expectation that we will then be able to select from options B, C, and D, although there doesn't seem to be much support for it, and that's where the real substantive discussion needs to be held, about finding the right balance for the reductions that the Bay region needs.
That would be in a motion to amend, not substitute, and it's the second amendment on this motion. This will be as deep as we'll get on this. We're going to vote on the amendment. So what it's giving is to take the reduction in 3 years and giving the board the option of selecting from B, C, or D.
Well, again, it's up to 3 years, so we'll have that discussion next.
Is there a second to that motion? Emerson?